Um, Hi, I'm Alex. I work at Russell's. We're a West End London law firm specialising in the music and entertainment industry. We've got a long history of music going back about 50 years. And we advise people of all stripes in the industry, from individuals to talent to the companies, major and independent. And music publishing is obviously one of the focuses within that. So I'll just share my screen now. Okay. Yes, so just a bit of an introduction. So these are the sort of topics I'm going to talk about. So a bit on what music publishing is in legal terms, because that sort of underpins the talk, and the music publishing industry in general. It's in some sense a fundamentally legal industry because it's based on the exploitation of a particular copyright work. I'll then just talk about in practice how compositions are exploited, because the music industry has developed terminology such as mechanical and sync that aren't really even legal terms. They're sort of industry terms that get sort of confusingly used in legal documents, and I think it's helpful to expand upon what those are. I'll then talk about PRS, because performance income and public performance of copyright works is a sort of important thing to understand before you then get to a publishing agreement, because there are certain assumptions about where that money's going and who's receiving it that underpin a publishing contract that you might be asked to look at or be asked to sign. Then I can talk a little bit about the different deal structures. So there are sort of relatively limited number of sort of stripes of agreement that you see. That doesn't mean that what's in those agreements is necessarily always the same, but in terms of generally what those agreements are trying to achieve, there are a few sort of basic parameters that we can talk about. And then finally, we'll talk about the kind of key deal terms. So, you know, why should you care what's in the deal in terms of pound signs, percentages, rights going one way, approvals, that sort of thing. So just to talk a little bit about the basics in legal terms. So what does publishing mean? I mean, publishing relates to musical compositions, and that's distinct from a sound recording of a musical composition. So that might be harder to conceptualize in certain forms of genre, types of genre of music, where maybe electronic music, where the compositional process and the recording process are sort of more or less one and the same thing. But thinking folk is probably one good example of a genre where performers are used to recording songs that might have been written by other people, either recently or in the case of folk music, often a long time ago, or there might not even be a known author of that work. But that I think there's an understanding in that genre of that a song is one thing and a recording of that song is another, and that's how our copyright law works. Essentially, is that there's one set of rights that attaches to the underlying song, the lyrics and the music, and there's a set of rights that attaches to the sound recording in that in that song. And the publishing and the recording industry administer and monetize those two different sets of rights. So just in terms of the legalities, so if you write a song, you'll be the first owner of the copyright in that song. Copyright means that you have certain exclusive rights in that song, which might include the right to copy, perform in public, so that might be performing live, for example, broadcast, so television and radio broadcast being the most obvious examples of that, and then make available online, which is sort of like the on-demand right, effectively. So the right to control on-demand uses on Spotify, for example, or YouTube of your song, and then adaptation, which is what it says, the right to make changes to that song. Copyright terms when it comes to musical works are longer than sound recordings. So sound recordings used to be 50 years, it's now been extended to 70. With a song, the copyright term lasts until 70 years after the writer dies, or if there's more than one writer, the last of them to die. something to be careful of, and I mentioned this in the context of sort of folk music, maybe it being particularly important, is it can be a bit dangerous to assume that a song is out of copyright just because the English and Welsh term has expired, because copyright is territorial. So it's whilst there are international treaties now that have brought a lot of these terms in line with each other, there might be a country in which the term is longer, and so whilst it's, you know, a song might be out of copyright or in the public domain in the UK or Europe, that might not necessarily be the case throughout the world. And then the sort of last legal point is that copyright can be assigned or licensed. So an assignment means a transfer of the ownership. A license means a permission to use that right. So, and that's where a publisher comes in. A writer might either transfer ownership or give the publisher an exclusive license of the exclusive right, and that means exclusively, even the writer doesn't control that right anymore, to exploit those songs for a period of time. So we can come on to that in a second. But so just in a more kind of practical music industry context, how are compositions actually exploited? You know, once somebody controls the rights in those songs, they can do certain things. And the things we tend to care most about in the context of music publishing is mechanical reproduction, which is traditionally refers to reproduction and distribution of a song on a physical format, so CDs or vinyl, or going back further, player pianos, and all sorts of sort of archaic examples of how a song might be mechanically reproduced in some format so that it can then be played. Mechanical is slightly confusingly, there's a sort of music industry habit, I think, of defining terminology based on technology at a particular time, and then when some new technology comes along, we sort of say, is that mechanical? Is it sync? And even though that, you know, mechanical reproduction is something that's sort of not really happening in a physical sense anymore, we tend to cling on to these terms. So we tend to use it in the digital era to refer to the temporary copy that's made of a song. When you know, when a user uses Spotify or YouTube, there are temporary copies being made of that song on their device, and that invokes the copying right that we talked about earlier. Synchronization, or sync, colloquially, refers to synchronizing a composition with a moving image. And again, it's an industry term, so people often use it in slightly different terms. Does that include YouTube, for example? Can be a bit of a contentious issue, but the most obvious examples of things which I think everyone would agree constitute a sync would be use in a film, use in a TV program, use in a video game or an advert. So if somebody wants to use your song in an advert, for example, if you didn't have a music publisher, they'd have to come and ask you and get a license for that use. And that's known as a sync license. Performing rights, which is something that's probably worth, well, we'll come on to discuss that in a slightly separate context from all these other rights, but just to explain, performing rights is the, confusingly, we tend to refer to it in the UK as both the public performance right, which is a subset of the performing rights. So public performance is if you perform a song, essentially, if the performer and the audience are in the same room. So playing live is a good example. Broadcast is another example of a performing right. And broadcast, in simple terms, is where there's a performance of a song that takes place at the performer or the broadcaster's, at the time of the performer or the broadcaster's choosing, but where the audience is somewhere else. So television, radio being the sort of most obvious examples of that. The making available right, which is the sort of third component of performing rights, is again where the performer and the audience are in different places, but this time the performance takes place, or the listening of the song takes place at the time of the choosing of the user. So that's on-demand streaming is a good example of that. So Spotify doesn't decide like Radio 1 does, when you get to listen to an Ed Sheeran song or whatever it is you're listening to, it's the user that gets to determine that. And all of those, that sort of bucket of 3 rights are known collectively as the performing rights. And those are the rights that PRS administers. We'll come back to that in a sec. And then lastly, print, although, you know, less and less important these days, it is really why music publishers are known as publishers, because they used to physically print sheet music and sell it. Even the major publishers don't really tend to do their own printing of sheet music these days. They tend to license those rights to third parties who do it on their behalf. But for certain writers, that can be a significant source of income. It depends on the genre, really, and the type of artist. Okay, so PRS. So in the UK, writers assign their performing rights, which is the 3 sets of rights I talked to you about earlier. So performing rights, public performance rights, broadcast rights, and making available rights in their compositions to PRS. So those are not rights that publishers actually acquire under their publishing agreements, and that's something that is often my job to make that kind of clear in the publishing agreement when acting for a writer. And PRS collects the resulting income. So traditionally they were collecting from establishments like clubs and bars and pubs and restaurants, and then also broadcasters, so radio stations and TV broadcasters, and then increasingly also for the use of the making available rights, they'll be collecting from companies like Spotify and YouTube for the use of those rights. And that's what we refer to as performing income or performance income. And there's a convention or sort of dictated by the contractual arrangements that PRS enters into with its writer members and also publisher members, that although PRS controls those rights, the publishers don't. They pay 50% of that income to publishers, and is known as the publisher's share, and they pay 50% of that to writers, and that is known as the writer's share. And there's a whole series of rules around how they determine what the PRS license fee that a bar might pay every year to PRS is then distributed across members and publishers as a whole. But that, in theory, if your song is getting played on the radio in a bar, or somebody's playing it in a club, or performing it live at a festival, there should be some performance income that makes its way back to you, the writer. And if you have a publisher, 50% of that should be going to your publisher as well. Okay, so really basic, because I think you've had other talks on this, but just in terms of, I think, things that factor into a publishing agreement that publishers do, is the sort of basic admin that goes along with administering songs. So there's a certain level of having to register compositions. In certain countries, they have registration systems. In the UK, we don't have a copyright registration system, but you do need to register your songs, or somebody needs to register your songs with PRS so that they know what they're collecting for. They will collect income from all other sources, so all secondary uses of the songs, so sync licenses we discussed earlier. If somebody wants to license your song for a film, publishers are very experienced in this. They know what fees to command. They have paperwork that they, standard paperwork that allows them to do that in a way that protects you. So they'll collect all that income and make sure they're getting paid for those uses, and then account to you, the writer, under your publishing agreement for your share. And we'll come on to what those publishing royalties might look like in a second. And then there's the sort of vagaries around, these won't necessarily be things that you'd see in a publishing contract. It's quite difficult to get a publisher to commit in a contractual sense to make promises that would, if they broke them, you could actually sue them and recover losses and recover damages. But a good publisher, an active publisher, will find songwriting opportunities for writers that are signed to them for an exclusive period of time. So we'll talk about single song assignments where that wouldn't really be part of the service, but if you're in a long-term relationship with a publisher, then you might hope that they would get you in writing sessions, for example, with other writers. That's certainly how it works in kind of pop music and other sort of mainstream genres. And then they should be finding active uses for your songs that go beyond just, maybe you recording them or somebody sort of making an initial recording. So pitching them for cover recordings, pitching them for syncs. A good publisher will have a team of people that goes out and isn't just passive and waits for those offers to come in, but goes out and sort of pounds the pavement and tries to drum up some interest in your songs. This is we can skip through this pretty quickly, but this is a kind of a diagram I prepared for another talk, actually. So it details the sort of recording side, which is the green side, but on the left-hand side, the orange side is sort of the publishing world, and the arrows are the rights and how rights flow across the industry. So you'll see that you've got a writer there who's assigning their certain rights to PRS. Those are the performing rights that we talked about. And then any other rights generally will be assigned by the writer in their songs to their publisher. And the publisher then, in certain cases, so with secondary licensees, so sync licenses, sample licenses, they would directly license those to, the TV production company or whoever. Certain rights are licensed by publishers on a collective basis. So MCPS on physical records for licensing the mechanical rights is done via MCPS, which is an organization that's related to PRS. So every time somebody, the logic being that if every time somebody wants to cover Yesterday by the Beatles, which I think is the most covered song in the world still, Paul McCartney and John Lennon's publishers don't want to be doing individual licenses every single time that happens. So they've effectively mandated this entity, MCPS, on standard terms. If you want to cover Yesterday, you go to MCPS and you say, I'd like to cover Yesterday by the Beatles, and they'll say, yes, here's the price, here's how the license works, and it's all totally sort of, automated effectively. And that sort of reduces the transaction costs of publishers having to, as I say, individually negotiate all of these licenses. And so, and then they also, so you'll see the big loopy arrow that goes from MCPS to labels. So that's how mechanical rights get licensed. And then the collection societies also license broadcasters. So I think that covers everything. We can skip through that. Deal structures. Okay, so there are sort of three main types of deals, I would say. So there's a single song assignment, which is the most simple type of publishing agreement. So that's where we're just talking, it does what it says on the tin. It just refers to a single song. So there might be one song that a publisher, I don't know, an example might be some of these sort of TikTok hits that are blowing up at the moment, where there might be somebody who's written one song. There's not really a long-term career in it for them, but a publisher's interested in that single song, collecting the income, administering the rights in that song, registering it, making sure that all the income gets collected. So they might do a deal with a writer for just that single song. Those are the most simple agreements you can come across. The other type of sort of agreements as administration agreements, which is where a publisher might take a more passive approach. So they might, I was talking about, getting writers into writing sessions and finding sync licenses. So an administration agreement, the publisher probably wouldn't do any of that. They would just do the basic registrations, administration, collecting income, paying royalties to the writer. But really, they're not trying to drum up any particular kind of extra uses or wring any extra income out of the songs. It's a sort of lean back, much more passive relationship, and as a result, they would take a much lower share of the income and pay a higher royalty to the writer. An exclusive songwriting agreement is the most sort of hands-on type of arrangement with a publisher. So that's an agreement where the songwriter would generally be signed to the publisher for a long-term period, and the publisher would take a much larger chunk, a larger margin, and pay a lower share to the songwriter. But in return, if all is going well, they've got their sync department trying to find uses for the songs, and they've got their A&R department trying to get the writer into sessions and that sort of thing. The difference in practice between these agreements tends to be really between administration agreements and ESAs tends to be really the rates. It doesn't tend, as I say before, doesn't tend to be a huge amount of language in there requiring publishing companies to actively procure syncs or get writers into sessions, because there's so many kind of circumstances around that. A publisher can't ultimately control whether your song is something that a Hollywood producer will want to put in their film. They can't ultimately control that other songwriters will necessarily want to write with you, but it tends to be reflected in the rates. Okay, and then just to get to the kind of meat of this, which is the kind of key deal terms. So, as I said, so the main thing is the first thing to think about is what does this publishing agreement actually capture? So, what songs does it apply to? So, is it a single song? So, the single song assignment I referred to earlier. Is it all songs that you as a songwriter write during a contractual period known as a term? So the active period in which you're writing with the publisher will tend to be defined as the term of the agreement. Or will it be what I've just said, but also any pre-existing songs? So often a publisher will come along and a songwriter might have actually already had their music released on recordings, and the recordings might have generated some income, but no one's collected that publishing income. So often what will underpin a sort of punchy advance that a publisher is willing to pay a writer is the fact that there's existing catalogue, which has accrued existing income, the publisher can go and collect immediately. So they'll know that if they pay you a £100,000 advance, there's actually 50 grand in the pipe already that they can go and collect. And that will then sort of support that advance. And then creative approvals. So that's something that flows from the grant of rights. So if you're assigning or licensing the rights in your songs for a period of time, if it's an exclusive license or an assignment, then unless your agreement says otherwise, your publisher can do what they like with those songs. And that's obviously something that's quite sensitive to songwriters. They don't necessarily want their songs being used in cheesy adverts or films they don't like, or endorsing products they might find offensive, gums or alcohol or certain meat products. I mean, it depends on the individual, religious and political and other beliefs of the writer, but there are certain areas that writers tend to be sensitive about their songs being used in. So part of my job when I'm acting for songwriters will be to write into the agreement a whole list of matters where the writer is required to be asked for their consent before those things happen. So before any sync is granted, the writer needs to be told by the publisher, and they have a certain number of days in which to make a determination either way as to whether or not they're prepared to agree for that sync to go ahead, for example. Okay, so then the next point, I think, so just some time periods, because people can get confused over these. So I've already talked about what a term is. So a term tends to be the period of time during which the songwriter is working with the publisher, and during that time it tends to be that the publisher will acquire all rights in all songs that the writer writes during that period. Terms were traditionally structured around minimum commitments. So back in the day where most of the income in music publishing was generated from mechanical royalties from the use of songs on sound recordings, a publisher that signed a writer would want to know that their songs were going to be used in sound recordings that actually got a proper release by a major record company with some proper marketing support behind it, so that the publisher had a decent chance of making some money from the songs. So terms tended to work as a sort of cycle. So you might be signed for effectively 2, 3, 4 album cycles. And in order to move on to the next sort of album cycle, an album of your songs needs to be released that fit a proper sort of major label release, hit certain criteria. So a term that might on the face of it have lasted for 2, 3, 4 years, each of those years would extend until the requisite release had been achieved, and the subsequent periods, the subsequent album cycles would be structured as options. So you might effectively be signed for a publishing agreement of maybe 3 contract periods. So in each contract period, it ran for a year, or if later, until maybe 6 months after the minimum commitment was achieved. So the release of that album with a certain number of your songs on it. And if you didn't achieve that minimum commitment in the year, then the term would just keep rolling. In the UK, we tend to put caps on those contract periods so that a writer isn't stuck in those deals forever. But in America, you don't get caps on contract periods often. And so there are writers who sign deals that they thought were going to last for 3, 4, 5 years. And they're still in them. They might even still be in the first year because they can't in this day and age get their songs into the right sort of release. When increasingly people are releasing music online or through digital distributors. So that's something to be kind of really look out for, I think, is how does that term work? How's it structured? To what extent do you control whether you can actually cycle through that term? And options, I think you've had talks on recording agreements and the like, but just for people who haven't heard those, an option is something that it's up to the publisher to decide if they pick up the writer for an option. And unlike recording agreements where the record companies making a huge investment often in making recordings that might put them off exercising options, publishers, other than maybe paying an advance on exercise of the option, they aren't making the same level of capital investment. So there's often a good reason for the publisher to keep on exercising the options, even if the writer's not necessarily happy with the working relationship or what they're getting out of their music publisher. Okay, so that's the term. I think worth spending a little bit of time on that. The retention period or the rights period. Once you've come out of your term, unfortunately, you don't tend to get your songs back. There was one publisher that was doing those deals a while ago, but even they've moved away from those. The publisher will usually, even if you're free to go off and do a deal with a new publisher for new songs, the songs that fell under the publishing agreement with the old publisher, the songs written during that term, will tend to stay with the publisher for a period of years. So it'll be maybe, traditionally publishers would retain those rights for as long as there was copyright. So we talked earlier about there being copyright existing until 70 years after the death of the writer. That's no longer the case. There tend to be rights reversions after anything from 10 to maybe 25 years after the end of the term. And then a collection period is at the end of that 25-year period, there might be money that's still owed to the publisher that's trickling back from exploitation that took place during the term and the retention period. So collection society income is quite slow to move its way around the pipes. So PRS might collect UK income quite quickly, but they have reciprocal agreements with collection societies all around the world. So Italy, France, Germany, Japan, China, you name it, they'll have agreements with all of these countries so that if your songs are getting played on a cafe stereo in a cafe in Japan or in an Italian nightclub or whatever, there should be some money that's trickling back. But it gets passed from society to society and it can take a bit of time to make its way back. And so generally the publisher will want the right to continue to collect that income even though their retention period has come to an end, because they'll say, well, no, that was the play took place during our retention period, we should get that. And the compromise position that tends to be reached in these agreements is for a limited collection period of 1 to 2 years. So I will write into your writing agreement, songwriting agreement, that yes, the publisher can continue to collect for 1 to 2 years from uses that took place during their term or their retention period, but after that, that money all goes straight to the songwriter. Okay, and then the money. So we've already talked about what these things are in terms of what's a mechanical use, what's a sync, what's performance income, what's print, and probably the key question you will have is what's a fair rate? How much should I be getting paid by my publisher? For an exclusive songwriting agreement, the standard used to be lower, but the standard rate these days is 75% and upwards. 75% is pretty standard. So the publisher would be paying a 75% royalty on all of these income streams. The one exception being publishers' share of performance. So you remember that PRS pays 50% of the publishing of the performance income arising from songs directly to writers. So you already get that 50% directly. So the remaining 50% that goes to the publisher, the convention is that they will pay half of that to the writer under the publishing agreement, because then the writer will then be receiving 75% in total. But that's something often that looks wrong in publishing agreements. You might have been promised a 75% rate, and you'll look at your publishing agreement and you'll say, well, hang on, I'm only getting 50% on performing income. And the reason is you're getting 50% of the whole directly from PRS, and you're getting 50% of the publisher's 50%, which is 25% from the publisher, which adds up to 75% overall. But publishing agreements don't tend to say that. They just sort of assume that you know that. The quirks tend to be that on mechanical income, a publisher might want a higher rate for covers that it's gone and procured. I think it's just worth thinking that through sometimes. If you're a songwriter that writes for other people, then by definition everything you do is a cover recording, or it's going to be recorded in a cover recording. So you'd want to make sure it's really clear that those are only covers that your publisher's really actively gone and got for you, not ones that you've gone and got for yourself. Same thing with sync. So publishers often like to take a higher rate on what they call procured sync. So if they've gone and got you a sync, they get to keep more. They pay you maybe 70% or 65%, and then the syncs that come to them that are known as windfall syncs, so syncs they didn't actually go and get themselves. They came in and somebody just phoned them and they picked up the phone, licensed the rights, would be a higher rate, so they'd pay 75%. Sometimes publishers say it's very difficult to know who's gone and got the sync, so we'll pay you a blended rate. So they'll say, we'll just assume, half of them we'll have got, half of them will have come to us, so let's just split it down the middle and say that we'll pay you 70% on everything. Whether that's fair depends on how much you believe that division of labour. I think a lot of syncs tend to be got as windfall syncs, not really through the active efforts of the publisher. So you could be a little bit cynical about whether those blended rates really make sense or stack up for the writer. And then on print, so as I said, publishers don't tend to do their own print music anymore. So, but they will have a rate for print music that they sell themselves, and then they'll usually have a rate for print music that they license to third parties, where they're receiving income from a third party. As I say, 75% is sort of the standard on sort of active publishing arrangements, exclusive songwriting agreements. For an admin deal, you're looking at a much higher rate, so it might be 85, 90, even upwards of that, if you're really kind of the sort of songwriter that's generating serious income, where a lower margin will still make sense for the publisher. Then just a few kind of technicalities. So One thing to be aware of is, don't just focus on the rates, focus on the basis of calculation of those rates. So a kind of an anecdote is Elton John from the 70s, I think it was, signed with Dick James, who's the Beatles publisher. And he signed a publishing deal that allowed Dick James to collect his publishing income and pay him 50%, which at the time was the sort of standard rate. It's obviously gone up to 75 now, but publishers used to pay 50-50. And it was based on the UK company's receipts. So Dick James, the organisation, had offices in Germany and it had offices in France and all sorts of other countries. And those companies would collect the money. So there'd be a sync generated in Germany and they'd collect £100 and they would take 50% of that. They'd pocket the 50 quid and then pay £50 back to Dick James, the UK company, which would then pay 50% of its £50 to Elton John. So you can see that actually of the £100 that was generated in Germany, Elton thinks he's getting 50, he's actually only getting 25. So this went to court, it was very messy, and a convention arose out of this where generally writers now will want to be paid on an at-source basis. So they'll say, I don't care, especially with a major publisher which has offices all over the world, I don't care that your German affiliate is taking a bit along the way and before it pays to the UK company. I want to know that if there's £100 being received at source, I'll get paid my 75% of that £100, not whatever makes its way back into the UK. If you're dealing with an independent publisher, you might have to do a receipts deal, but it's important to make sure that, because independent publishers don't necessarily have their own administrative functions around the world, they might need to use overseas publishers, sub-publishers, and pay maybe 10% as a fee to that sub-publisher. So they'll say, well, look, we're having to give away 10%, we're only getting 90% of the income, so we'll pay you on the 90%. Whether that makes sense or whether you prefer to be doing an at-source deal with a major publisher really depends on, do you think that your indie publisher is going to be doing more for 90% than for your royalty, which is calculated on 90%, than the major publisher is going to be doing for your royalty that's calculated on 100%. And the important thing, I think, with a receipts deal is just to make sure that that the amount that they can deduct is capped under the agreement. So, they shouldn't be deducting more than 10%, 15%, 20%. Try and tie it to what their actual arrangements are. Accounting and audit. So the convention generally is that you'll get paid twice a year. If you can get quarterly accounting, then great. And you'd want audit rights in your publishing agreement. So if you're in a position where you're paying royalties as opposed to a flat fee in any sort of royalty arrangement, how do you know what you're getting paid is correct? You don't really. If you're not receiving much money from your publisher and your song's gone to #1, you might suspect that something's up. And you would need clauses in your agreement that allow you, rather than having to go and sue your publisher without really knowing what money's at stake, to audit them. So you have a clause that says you can appoint an accountant, send them into the company to check the books, and if you've been underpaid, they rectify the underpayment. And if you've been underpaid by a material amount, they'll also pay for the costs it costs you to appoint the auditor to go in and vet them in the first place. And then lastly, advances. So I think people can get confused about what an advance is, but I find it easiest to just think of an advance as a prepayment of royalties. So if you're in a deal where your publisher is paying you £75 of every £100 they collect, and they pay you a £100 advance, you don't recoup at the point where the publisher receives 100 quid, because your share of that 100 quid is £75. So at the point where they've received 100 quid, they've actually prepaid you £100 already. So actually your share of the £100 that they now receive is only 75%, it's not 100%. So if you think of an advance, it's a prepayment of your royalty, and until such time as your royalty would equal the advances you've been paid, the publisher has the right to continue to credit any royalties that would have been paid to you otherwise against that unrecouped advance. Hope that makes sense. That's really the sort of key points I wanted to talk about today. So, Tom, I think you had some questions.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was really comprehensive, and I think it always takes me by surprise how complicated these deals can be and how bespoke. I've got quite a few questions. I guess we can just sort of start at the top and work through and see how many we get to in the remaining sort of 15 minutes or so. The first one I've got here, they're in kind of in no particular order, but they're quite bespoke, the nature of these deals that you were talking about. Is an artist likely to get better splits if they wait until they've got more success or have achieved a higher publishing income elsewhere?
It's so the splits don't tend to move massively. So as I say, 75% for a kind of an active songwriting arrangement, an ESA type deal, 75% is pretty standard. If you're doing well, you might get up to 80. Higher than that if you're sort of a superstar. But I wouldn't say that it's the splits that tend to move around too much. It's more the size of the advance that the publisher might be willing to offer. So as I said, the longer your songs are out there doing something before a publisher comes along and collects that income, the more that they can, more income they can project against the advance they're going to pay you, and use that as a basis to sort of support the size of the advance that they want to pay. And it tends, in my experience, to be sort of often quite mathematical. They look at what they think is out there and what they can collect, and really base it on that. Obviously, if somebody's kind of sensationally hyped and every publisher in the world is chasing after them, then that might slightly move the needle on that. But yeah, it helps to have a bit of income in the pipe before you sign, certainly.
That's really clear. In terms of, we've heard a lot about record deals elsewhere in the Folk Talk Academy program, and a lot of artists say that they rarely recoup on major record deals. Is that true for publishing deals in your experiences? Would artists expect to recoup on the advances?
Yes, it's easy to recoup a publishing advance because publishers perform useful functions, but they're not financially investing in music in the same way that a record label is. So record labels get often a bad name for some of their accounting practices or how recoupment works, which I think is sometimes born of a misunderstanding as to what they're doing, what function they provide. But traditionally, a music publisher wouldn't be paying to market your recordings. They wouldn't be paying to manufacture your recordings. They wouldn't be paying to make those recordings in the first place, which are all functions that a label provides. The only recoupable costs on a publishing deal normally are advances. So they advance you royalties, they prepay you some of the royalties that you would have received at some point in the deal. And so the question as to whether you recoup is really whether the royalties that you earn over the life of the deal add up to the size of the advances that they've already paid you. And if I can just sort of go on a slight tangent, be wary of doing deals where records and publishing are mixed up. So you will sometimes see a company want to sign an artist for their records and their publishing. Certain companies have publishing arms and record arms, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with signing a deal with each. But it's when those deals just cross over, and where a record label is saying, I can collect your publishing income and then use that publishing income to recoup the recording expenses that I've paid, or the marketing expenses I've paid, or the distribution or manufacturing expenses. Because as I said, publishing income should be the sort of income where you hopefully recoup in reasonable time and you start to receive royalties. It shouldn't then be swallowed up, recovering costs that are your record labels, that your record label wasn't able to recover from your recording income. So that's something where I think people get into a bit of a mess, signing these pretty kind of exploitative deals, and I think that's a bit of a no-no.
That's really clear. Thank you. So you spoke about term limits and the timings on that. But can you talk a little bit more about extending or rolling on an agreement that a publisher and an artist might sign? Is it something where the publisher has the first refusal to say, right, okay, well, let's sign another wave agreement for some more songs? Or is an artist able to say, I'd like to redo this, or maybe I don't want to continue working with this publisher? How does the kind of, I don't know, like the extension of an existing contract happen?
Yeah, so there's two things really. There's exercising options under the existing agreement, and there's extending an agreement. So if I can make that distinction, so when you sign on day one, the agreement should set out how many contract periods, how many options the publisher has over you. And by the way, there's a sort of move away a little bit from those sort of deals towards maybe more term-based deals. So sometimes you might just do a deal that's just for 3 years, and that's it. And at the end of the 3 years, if no one wants to do anything more, they don't have to. And if you want to extend, then it would require both parties to agree to that. But if you're doing a more old-fashioned option-based deal, options are exercised at the election of the publisher, not the writer. So it's the publisher that decides, at the end of that period, do I want to continue this for my contractual additional periods, or do I not? And it's not really up to the writer. And as long as the publisher complies with the publishing agreement, which will normally, if I'm doing my job right, require them to pay an additional advance each time, so that they're not incentivized to just keep stringing you along without you getting any sort of corresponding benefit at all. Generally, as a writer, and we do deal with this, where publishers exercise options and the writer didn't necessarily want them to, and they've just got to see out that period. Sometimes you can have a reasonable conversation with the publisher and say, look, this isn't really working, and they're disappointed you made these promises during, over the signing table, and it never amounted to anything. But it's not a surefire bet. And I think if you're signing a publishing agreement with options, you need to assume that you might be in a position where the publisher exercises them, and it's not up to you, it's up to them. In terms of extending a deal, if you've done your deal for an initial contract period plus 2 options, after that, once you get to the end of option 2, extending that deal is something that would require both parties to agree to. And sometimes what will happen is publishers, just like labels, don't necessarily want a successful artist to fall out of contract. So they might, when you're in option 1, they think, oh, we've only got another option left. We don't really want to risk them going off to our competitor at the end of it. So they might give you a chance to renegotiate your deal as you go, because they'll say, well, look, we'll add a few extra periods onto the end of the current deal. And then my job would be to say, okay, cool, but can we up the advance for option 2, and can we change the royalty rate, and can we negotiate this, that, and the other? So that's a more sort of favourable sort of scenario.
What about advice in terms of the kinds of deal? You mentioned whether it's the 3 types of publishing deal that you suggested, which included an admin deal or a more comprehensive thing. Do you have any advice for an emerging artist who's sort of starting out? Maybe they don't know what they might be able to achieve from a publisher. Are they better signing a more basic admin deal than going in for a full publishing, for the full sort of, the support around trying to get songwriting opportunities or sync placements? I mean, what kind of advice can you give to an emerging artist?
Yeah, I mean, there's one school of thought that says that actually publishing agreements are sort of at worst can be a very expensive bank loan. If you don't need a big advance that a publisher will use as an excuse to get you on a sort of 75% deal where they're taking 25% of the income, you'd be better off doing a sort of an ongoing admin deal. It just rolls along, and they collect the money for you for a pretty modest rate. You've got the sort of not only do the larger publishers do admin agreements, but you've also got sort of specialist services like sort of Centric that offer those services as well. It very much depends. It depends, you know, are you a professional songwriter where you need a publisher to be getting you in the right rooms and writing with people? With all of these deals, it's so hard to make sort of generalizations, because it sort of, you need to talk to people, you need to see what the offers that you're actually getting are. It's all well and good talking in the abstract, but you know, if you decide that you're made for a major label, a major publishing deal, and no major publisher wants to sign you to one, then it's not a conversation that there's much point in having. Equally, if you've got all the major publishers in the world offering you deals, and you don't really truly believe that they're going to be working your songs or getting in the right rooms or working your catalogue, then you might prefer to do an admin deal. And actually something that happens with major writers often in the course of their career, when they start to get their rights back, when rights revert at the end of retention periods, they will actually maybe just hire a pretty skeleton staff to just administer internally, because they know that actually the songs are going to do their own job of, you know, Paul McCartney, does he need somebody going out and pushing his songs on Hollywood producers? Probably not. So is he better off to, you know, just hiring somebody to kind of do the registrations and collect the income for him?
Yeah, I think that's really clear. A couple more, if I may.
Sure.
Are there always advances in a publishing deal, and if an artist is offered a publishing deal without an advance, should they still consider it?
So most admin deals won't involve an advance, because the publisher's not taking a huge margin, and then it's a sort of low risk, higher volume sort of business. You might see publishing agreements at the early stage which either don't pay advances or pay. They might, you know, I've seen deals where there's a sort of, you know, maybe an equipment fund, or there might be a sort of a pot of money allocated for a specific purpose or for writing trips. I think if somebody's paying you 75% of the income, you could have gone and got someone else to collect for 10%, and they're taking 20%, and they're not willing to pay you in advance, and they don't seem to have much of a support system. You might wonder, what am I getting for this? Is this a sort of small publisher that's just sort of set up to sort of, you know, insert itself between its own administrator and you, and is creaming off some of the income in the middle? Is this really a kind of legitimate operation? I think, you know, I wouldn't do an ESA that didn't pay in advance, because I'm not really sure what you're getting out of it.
Yeah, that's clear. For bands who are writing collectively, how do publishing deals work there, or are they always done with an individual writer? What happens if a band member lineup changes when writing music?
Yeah, so publisher will ideally sign all 4, 3, 2, 5, however many there are in the band, because if you're the publisher of, I don't know, Take That, let's think of a pop example, you know, who was the big writer in Take That at the time? It was Gary Barlow. No one probably would have predicted that Robbie Williams would have gone off and written a whole load of kind of blockbuster songs that generated, you know, #1 hits. So the publisher that signed Gary Barlow on his own and didn't bother pick up the rest of the band might have regretted that. And the publisher that signed all 5 of them to a deal and had provisions in there, which we call leaving member provisions, that basically says that if one of the band wants to leave, they have an option to then split the agreement and decide if they pick up that individual for future songs. They have the ability to then drop the rest of the band or pick them up. So basically every time a band member leaves, there's a sort of fork in the road, and the publisher basically kind of draws a line and says, look, this is your unrecouped balance for, you know, the first album or the first couple of albums. When it comes to what would have been album 3, you know, I have an option to pick up Robbie for his own deal. have an option to pick up the rest of the band for their third album, and you start sort of dealing with quite complicated provisions for sort of how you work out the accounting for old songs, new songs, songs they wrote together, songs they wrote separately. But yes, you would generally, a well-advised publisher would usually want to pick up the whole band and have those sort of provisions that allow them to continue to work with the writer even after they split off from the main group.
So, but effectively, they might pick up a whole band, but they would sign an individual deal with each individual band member.
No, they will generally sign a single songwriting agreement on what we call a joint and several basis. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Last one, probably a bit of a complicated one, but obviously the music industry has changed significantly over the past 10 years with the streaming platform specifically. Have there been any major changes in the way that publishing deals have been structured based on the developments and the importance of streaming, in the same kind of way that record label deals made in the 70s just can't really or don't really account properly for that change in the economic landscape of the music industry?
Yeah, I think the main one is around term structures. To go back to that one, so I'm working on the moment on a renegotiation of a publishing deal for a reasonably well-known band who signed their first deal back in the early 2000s. So, I mean, the digital revolution was already kind of underway, but that publishing agreement talked about in each contract period, the band having to ensure that there was an album, 80% of which or 70% of which was made up of songs written by them, and the album was released by a major label, and the major label distributed that album in physical retail shops in reasonable numbers, so there's about 3 things in there that just wouldn't work for even that band now, where they're sort of no longer on a major label. People aren't necessarily buying their music in physical shops, and where they, so that's one of the things that we've sort of seen changes, is these kind of quite old-fashioned minimum commitment requirements that are all based around sort of major label releases. They used to make sense because there wasn't really an alternative. So if you put out your music independently, you'd be selling that music in car boot sales, and the publisher would be pretty pissed off about it. But now you can legitimately sell that music pretty much directly through DSPs. It could be streamed in absolutely huge quantities, and you might find that you're in these deals and you're stuck in them because you can't fulfill the obligation to get through the contract periods, because yes, your publisher's made loads of money, yes, your album went to #1, but it wasn't through a major label, and it didn't get sold in HMV. So you've got these hurdles you can't kind of make, and so something we're trying to do is sort of soften up those requirements or get rid of them altogether. So, and I think in the US, I think maybe they're even further ahead of us in terms of having term-based deals. So you basically just say, I'll sign to you for 3-year period. I don't have to give you, maybe I'll have to give you a certain number of songs in that time, but I'm not making any promises about who's going to release them and how they're going to be released. And if my account's unrecouped in 3 years' time, then it extends until it does recoup, maybe capped at 5 years or something like that. But so there's some mechanism which allows the publisher to make that their money and to make sure that you recoup your advance, but isn't sort of tied to these rather archaic structures and ideas about how it is that a publisher makes its money, which really just don't correlate with modern day reality.